Welcome back, boxing fans, to another great show with Sean on boxing, brought to you by Atari. We're going to be talking about Inoue. Obviously, he's flown into the States and has just moved to Vegas in preparation for next weekend's big matchup between him and Cardenas. So we're going to talk about that and much more after this short break. See you in a minute. Welcome back, everyone. So obviously, Inoue is a guy that's really kicking ass and taking names and getting a lot of attention globally. Obviously, a lot of Americans have been asking for him to come to the States, questioning his validity based on him not fighting consistently in the US. And only by fighting in the US can he really become a sensational fighter. You know, this is the narrative some Americans would love to push, even when he's selling out 60,000 stadiums in Japan. And obviously, number 6 on the Forbes boxing most money made in 2024. So all of that would indicate that no, he doesn't need America. But like any great athlete, you do travel around. You look at basketball players that represent the U.S. They travel and play in different countries, representing the states in the Olympics. You look at golfers and tennis players and all other athletes who travel the world consistently for tournaments and competitions. So it's not unusual to go abroad to try to prove yourself and to take on competition. The funny thing is, Inouye's already done it far more than the majority of American fighters. This is his 5th time coming to the States. It should have been his 6th, but obviously because of COVID, his fight with Casemiro was canceled. But in and around that, obviously, Inouye's really uh, been skyrocketing, right? Moving up, 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 up. Just signed a deal with Turki Al Sheikh, obviously to represent Riyad's season. These kind of things, definitely help your global profile. And so now he is coming back to the States. He's not taking on a huge opponent. So as far as the amount of attention you think it would gravitate in the US is probably going to be lukewarm, not as hot as if he actually had an opponent to help him sell the fight. But nonetheless, it seems as if everyone's talking about him. His face is all over social media, and he is the talk of the town. So we'll have to see how it works out. I heard that 10,000 people had already bought tickets for the event, which is obviously fantastic. I think the place holds 20 at maximum. So we'll see next week what the final tally is. But anything over 10,000 coming from Japan to the States, fighting in Vegas against a very little known Mexican opponent, you have to say is a success. But obviously, the haters are going to find ways to hate because that's what they do. And we don't expect anything different from them. But let's look at Inoue and what he's been doing in the boxing world. So, Inoue in Vegas, announcing himself to the huge media presence that obviously follows him around. It's smart what they're doing. He's going to be capping this long weekend of boxing. Obviously, the New York card with Ryan Garcia, Devin Haney, and Tio, which is a sensational card happening in New York, which is going to get a lot of attention as well. And you got to think that those two events are really going to sort of take a little bit from each other, right? Because obviously one's in New York, one's in Vegas, and then you have Canelo Alvarez on the Saturday, who's going to be in Riyadh season, fighting outside North America for the first time of his career. And then to cap this long weekend off is going to be Inoue in Vegas. And the way they scheduled it, it's going to be coming after a Dodgers game. So they're going to just sort of follow each other from ESPN baseball to ESPN boxing. And it's a smart thing because, a huge Japanese American fan base is going to be watching Shohei Ohtani for the Dodgers, and they hope that viewership will just slide right over to watch Inouye's fight in the States. Excuse me. Turmeric tea. Holy crap. That stuff just goes right to your nose. I have a bit of a bronchitis, so I'm trying a bunch of healthy, normal remedies to try to get it out of my lungs. So if I cough today, you know why. But let's jump through this and talk about things that have been popping up. So obviously, one of the perks about signing with Riyad Season and representing Riyad Season as an ambassador, which Inoue signed last year, is eventually expecting him to do a fight in Riyad Season. And I saw an article on Boxing Scene that was talking about he was going to be fighting, obviously, this fight in May, his fight with MJ in September, and then a fight with Junto Nakatani in December. But that didn't sound right to me. And after listening to some different people, and actually Inoue came out recently and basically said that it's going to be Cardenas, MJ, and then Nick Ball, right? Which made a lot of sense. And then Junto after that. So the question is, if he moves up to 126 to become a 5-weight world champion, is he then going to come down to face Junto, or is he going to pull Junto up 2 weight divisions? Hopefully, he's just pulling Junto up to 122 to fight for undisputed. That's obviously far more significant. You can go win a title at 126 and then drop it and come down and remain the 122-pound champion. It makes the most sense, but we'll see how it all unfolds. But he was talking about regaining his pound for pound number one status. And obviously, some criticism was kicked out because of his last 3 opponents, Cardenas being one of them. Yet what people, haters primarily, aren't telling you is that these opponents weren't the opponents that Inoue and his team were selecting. The opponents they were selecting were their mandatory opponents. And because of their mandatory opponents' personal issues or uninterest in actually challenging themselves to fight for the highest payday of their careers and for undisputed, these guys basically dropped the ball. And that was Sam Goodman on several situations, which led to Inoue fighting 2 opponents which weren't Sam Goodman, all because of Sam Goodman injuring himself and having other issues that stopped that fight from happening. And he was a 2 sanctioning body mandatory. So by beating him, you would have covered or checked boxes for 2 of your 4 sanctioning bodies, which would have been obviously great. It would have gave you a lot of freedom as far as which opponents you could then pick and chase after that. And then this week with Cardenas, they were chasing their other mandatory, who is Picasso. But Picasso turned down that fight, so Cardenas was a replacement opponent. So the last 2-3 fights should have been against mandatory opponents, which obviously, if you're unified, there's a lot of pressure from the sanctioning bodies for you to fight your mandatories. We obviously saw Canelo recently get stripped by the IBF at 168. We also just saw Bivol get stripped by the WBC at 175 pounds. So you can see there's a lot of pressure. Also, Usyk was sort of forced into giving up his IBF title or be stripped at heavyweight. So, it's not surprising that Inoue is trying to check all the boxes and dot his I's and cross his T's. But even in doing that, he still comes under scrutiny, especially when these opponents that were going to be criticized anyway. If he would have fought Goodman or Picasso, the haters still would have been critical of him regardless. So it doesn't matter because they are not huge names and super accomplished. So that means that they are shitty fighters and not worth the conversation. But obviously, his next opponent, if he wins against Cardenas, is going to be MJ Akhmedov, the ex-unified champion and obviously Olympian, who is a very good fighter, Uzbekistani fighter. His only loss come to Marlon Tapales after an injury and long layoff. So most people feel he would have beat him under better circumstances. And then, of course, Nick Ball, which if Inoue goes up to 126 and takes on Nick Ball, it allows him to become one of less than 10 fighters in boxing history to become 5-weight world champions, which is historic. It's the same thing basically Bud Crawford is trying to do by taking on Canelo Alvarez, which will also make him a 5-weight world champion as well. And then, of course, Junto Nakatani, who later this summer is going to become a unified bantamweight champion. already is a three-weight world champion and obviously is already listed on the pound for pound list. And then there's still the underlying potential fight with Bam Rodriguez if Inoue does stay at 122, making it a little more possible for Bam to potentially move up and take on that opponent. But let's move through and see what else we have to talk about. So it's been almost 2,000 days since Inoue last heard the final bell in a fight. 2,000, so 1,981 days since Donaire went the distance with Inoue. And even in that fight, if people are being completely honest, Donaire was knocked out in that fight by a body shot. And only because the ref fucked that shit up did Donaire actually survive. If the ref would have counted normally and not botched shit up, Inoue would have got the stoppage win versus Donaire as well. He hit him with a great body shot. There was a hesitation, and then obviously Donaire went down, and the ref really sort of helped Donaire survive, which then allowed him obviously to get to the final bell, being the last person to go the distance with the monster. So it'll be interesting to see out of these next opponents that are going to be in front of Inoue, Cardenas, MJ, Nick Ball, Junto, which are the four fights that he listed in a press conference as his next four opponents. He already told you who he's going to fight. So expectation is not something you need to guess about. It's obviously solidified. If he wins this fight, he's taking on this guy. If he wins that fight, he's taking on this guy. If he wins this fight, he's taking on that guy. So his roadmap is fucking cemented. So it's very obvious what he's doing, and he's doing that because he wants to put himself in position to once again be elevated to the pound for pound number one position in boxing. Here's some photos of Inoue once he landed in Vegas, obviously doing a little workout in front of the media and the cameras. I do think he'd already been in Los Angeles prior to this, just sort of letting his body adapt to the time changes, obviously coming from Japan to North America. And then he flew to Vegas to do a face-off with Cardenas and do a public workout. Here's the face-off right here. And during the interview, an interesting quote was put out, which was interesting because we talked about Inoue being compared to some of the other historically great smaller fighters in boxing. And two or three of the fighters mentioned are these guys right here. Two of them, I didn't really mention Marquez because obviously he went on to fight at 147. So I didn't really list him as a smaller fighter. But he said, my father watched Barrera, Morales, and Marquez. So those are some of the Mexican fighters I'm fond of. And obviously, there's a lot of similarities between specifically Barrera and Morales and Inoue. Very skilled fighters, good power, great offensive fighters that were in great fights. And obviously, Inoue already had his historical matchup with Donaire. It was a great fight. Donaire obviously broke his orbital bone. Inoue later went on to basically stop him with a great body shot. And then the rematch came out and destroyed him unceremoniously. As you can see by here, Cardenas is not a small man. He's pretty broad. Obviously, he's just as tall, maybe a little taller, a shade taller than Inoue. I'm not sure what his reach is right now, but we can check that out as we move forward. He's a hard puncher. Obviously, for him, this is a career opportunity, right? Picasso was the man that should have been in this position. Picasso coming off of a great win versus Reece Salim, right? Oh, sorry, that's not Picasso. Picasso came off with a great win with the Armenian fighter. I can't remember his name, but Sam Goodman was the guy who had beaten Reece Salim, who's going to be fighting next weekend, I think, as well, at 126 pounds. So it's funny because this is the layout as listed by Inoue in the press conference with the media, that these are the next four opponents he's going to fight. Obviously, two guys with one loss. As Cardenas has one loss, MJ has one loss. And then, of course, Junto and Nick Ball, both undefeated world champions right now. And I'm pretty sure I was saying that Inoue, if he beat the next two fighters, he was going to end up having like 22 world champions that he ended up beating in his career so far. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a pretty long list of world champions on his list. And, this is two more fighters that are obviously undefeated world champions. So those would both be very good names and potentially bigger and better names moving forward. A lot of people have very high expectations for Junto. That's why he is currently on most people's pound for pound lists. As far as Nick Ball, um, I think currently at the 126 pounds, he's probably the most stalwart fighter there. The rest of the guys look like potentially they could eventually grow out of that division. Nick Ball being a very stocky Tank Davis type of fighter, you could see that for him, probably the rest of his career would be beneficial to stay at 126, where he's not going to be necessarily giving up even more reach and height advantage against bigger and taller fighters. If he moves to 130, it's just going to become more of an issue. But we'll see how he makes weight. Obviously, he's not that old, and he's a pretty stocky fellow, so we'll see how he is able to control his weight with his body type, which, like Tank Davis, potentially limits your opportunity to move through multiple weight divisions. But the three guys at the end of this, I'm super excited about these fights. I mean, I won't say that MJ, Junto, and Nick Ball are the best opponents on Inoue's resume because you have other very good fighters. Obviously, Donaire, a future Hall of Famer. Obviously, Stephen Fulton, who deserves to be right on this list. A guy who now currently is a two-weight world champion, had been unified previously at 122. Then you have guys like Rodriguez, obviously Maloney, Navarez, who very easily could also be a future Hall of Famer as well. Hernandez, obviously his Japanese countryman, his name escapes me, who I'm not sure if he was a unified champion at 108 pounds, but I know he was a champion at 108 pounds. Obviously fought uh, a little round robin with quite a few of the top fighters in that weight division. Um, but this would be fantastic. And stylistically, these are three very different style matchups, which is probably the most interesting aspect of this. You get MJ, who, like Inoue, is a very good fundamental fighter, good technically proficient guy, obviously with a great amateur pedigree coming out of the Uzbekistani boxing school, fast feet, fast hands, and quite a bit of power. Not the biggest fighter, a little diminutive, but meaning the same size as Inoue, not a guy who's a giant or gigantuan for the weight class. And primed, a guy who's younger than Inoue. Obviously, his one loss came after an injury and inactivity, so people think that was something not to pay too much attention to. That obviously, for me, as I said, for him building up to potentially get a rematch or to potentially get a fight with Inouye, I would have liked to see him rematch to Paulus, right? MJ versus Tapales in the rematch, you go out there and you beat him definitively. That only upsells the possibility of an Inouye MJ fight. Now you have a common opponent that you both beat. It becomes a far more interesting and far more intriguing fight. But obviously, their promoter, Eddie Hearn, and his team, MJs, feel that it's best just to wait around for the opportunity. I don't know if really that's the best thing to do, but we will see. As far as Junto, he's not sitting around waiting. He's going to fight Nishida to become a unified bantamweight champion, right? Just elevating that fight even more, specifically for the Japanese fan base. And I knew there was conversation from Turkey about potentially trying to do Junto and Inouye in Saudi Arabia, but that's a no bueno. That's not a fight that should be done anywhere except Japan. If MJ is done in Japan and Junto's done in Japan, perfect. Then you have Nick Ball you can do in Saudi Arabia, which is great. I would have thought MJ would have been a good opponent for Saudi Arabia as well, but obviously we know Saudi Arabia and the UK are connected. So a Nick Ball fight against Inouye in Saudi is huge. Obviously, Inouye wouldn't want to fight in Nick Ball's backyard, being the A side. He wouldn't want to give away home court advantage to the Brit. So then you do it in neutral territory, and that is Saudi Arabia. So that fight makes tons of sense. It's obviously for 5 weight divisions. The only draw on Nick Ball's resume was a controversial draw versus Ray Vargas for the WBC title. Right now, Nick Ball potentially could be a two-belt unified champion at 126 pounds if he wouldn't have got fucked over against Ray Vargas in that fight. But I'm excited about all these fights. Obviously, some more than others, but stylistically, very different fighters. Fast, athletic, very technical fighter, long power puncher, short, stocky, aggressive, come forward, in your grill type of fighter. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how Inoue stylistically is able to adapt from fight to fight to fight against very different style matchups. And you're definitely not picking and choosing guys that benefit you stylistically because all three of those guys are completely different. Completely different. But let's move forward. So, obviously, as I said, Inoue, his next fight will mark his 25th straight world title fight. So imagine that 25 world title fights back to back to back to back. That's pretty exciting. It obviously says a lot about him as a fighter. A lot of people are critical, but there's not many people out there who've had 25 straight world title fights. Actually, I don't think any of the guys on the pound for pound list outside of Inoue can say that, even Bud Crawford. Um, and then, of course, we know the whole point of this was for him to pass Crawford and Usyk to become pound for pound number one again. In the live I did yesterday or the day before, I was talking about whether Inoue goes in there and earns that right by beating these four opponents in destructive fashion, becoming a five-weight world champion, obviously beating a pound for pound fighter and elevating yourself on the Ring Magazine's pound for pound list. The reality is, by the end of 2025, both Terence Crawford and Alexander Usyk very well may be retired. They may be retired before Inoue even fights Junto Nakatani in 2026, which would mean that he would obviously be elevated to the number one position just based on their retirement. So inevitably, it's not going to take much for Inoue to once again become pound for pound the number one fighter in boxing. And obviously, this is going to be to many people's chagrin because the last thing they want to see is a non-Black American fighter hold down that position. Right now, they're in their feelings because a Ukrainian fighter is holding down that position. So you can only imagine what they would feel like if a Japanese fighter was holding down that position. But inevitably, it is what's going to happen because when you go down that pound for pound list, there's nobody outside of Crawford and Usyk who deserves to be anywhere near Inoue. Bivol is the closest one, and he's a one-weight world champion. So, he's got a lot more to prove to put himself into that rarefied air as Bud Crawford, Inoue, and obviously an Alexander Usyk. Three two-weight undisputed champions. All three of them have accomplished that. Bivol, not yet. If he goes to cruiserweight and is able to do that by beating, say, David Benavidez and then Jao Pitaya to become undisputed in the second weight division, then you definitely put him right in that conversation with Inoue. And it'll be interesting to see what other up-and-coming fighters potentially are going to elevate themselves into this conversation as well. Right now, I mean, you have quite a few fighters, but I don't think any of them have shown the inclination to really do what they need to do to put themselves into this position. But let me know if you agree or disagree. Maybe you feel some of these younger fighters are closer to that position than I do. Let me know. I don't think so, but other people don't have to agree with me. I was thinking about where Inoue is right now, historically, when you compare him with some of the best small fighters in boxing history. Obviously, Marquez and Pacquiao, who ended up spending a long period of their time at welterweight. I didn't put them on this list because even though they went through the lower divisions, they primarily weren't small weight fighters, whereas the rest of these guys spent the majority of their career in the smaller weight divisions. Whether we're talking about the great fighter Ruben Olivares, 89 wins, 13 losses, 3 draws with 79 KOs. Talk about power puncher. Roman Gonzalez, who obviously still seems as if he has another fight left in him. We'll see if he's able to move to bantamweight to try to become a five-weight world champion, which for me would be great. I'd love to see that. Or if he tries to get a big money fight with a Bam Rodriguez, which, well, I'd still enjoy the fight. Obviously, at this point, I feel he'd make more sense for him to fight Ioka, another old fighter, right? Which would be a little more fair of a matchup. Currently 52-4, 42 knockouts, only knocked out once, obviously coming off of a controversial loss and the death of his trainer, which, I attribute a lot of that to that. Then, of course, you got Kosei Galaxy, the hard punching police officer, soldier from Thailand, who went 47-1 with 41 KOs. His only loss coming very early in his career. And obviously, then he went on a long streak, I think, of over 40 fights without a loss, and obviously with a great KO percentage as well. And then, personally, my favorite, Salvador Sanchez, 44-1-1, 32 knockouts, never knocked out. His loss also coming very early in his career as well, as many Mexicans do get beat early in their careers because they don't have much amateur pedigree, so they learn in the pros. And sometimes when you learn in the pros, you take an early loss, and that's obviously the situation with him. Obviously, he passed away very early due to a car crash, so we didn't really get to see the best of Salvador Sanchez. Marco Antonio Barrera, another personal favorite of mine, 67-7, only knocked out once by Junior Jones, 44 KOs, great fighter. And then, of course, his arch nemesis, Eric Morales, 52-9, 3 KOs, 36 knockouts. Growing up, I was a Barrera fan. I didn't really appreciate Morales until I got older. And sort of now, I think stylistically, I prefer Morales to Barrera. But obviously, growing up and watching them, I was a big Barrera fan. I wasn't much of a Morales fan at the time. Kind of similar to really liking Marvin Hagler a lot more now. But when obviously he was fighting Leonard, I was all over Leonard, and I wasn't a big fan of Hagler at that time. And then you have Ricardo Lopez, 51-0-1, a better overall record than Floyd Mayweather. Uh, obviously, a one-weight world champion, historically great Mexican fighter. Because he fought at such a small weight, some people overlook him and don't necessarily give him the overall attention he may deserve. But he is obviously one of the best fighters in history. A guy like Salvador Sanchez, who got a lot of push to the U.S. market thanks to Don King, who always put them on his cards. And because of that, both of these guys had quite a big American following, especially for smaller weight fighters. Obviously, Morales and Barrera as well, because of the great clashes amongst themselves, along with Pacquiao and Marquez. Kosei Galaxy, unfortunately for him, he never crossed over to the American market, so most American boxing fans aren't aware of who he is. Roman Gonzalez did cross over, a lot of that thanks to Gennady Golovkin putting him on his undercards, and then Ruben Olivares, again, people may remember a few of his bigger fights, but a guy that obviously was more loved in Mexico and not highlighted as much to the U.S. market. So, who do you rate the best small fighter of all time? At this point, when you think about what Inouye's done at 31 years of age, becoming a four-weight world champion, becoming undisputed in two weight divisions, um, obviously looking as if he's going to be moving up to his fifth weight division to become a five-weight world champion if he beats Nick Ball, traveling around the world, obviously has a huge fan base in Japan, which is making him millions and millions and millions of dollars, the face of Japanese boxing. Clearly, the only Japanese athlete that's more loved and renowned than him is obviously the baseball player, right? But other than that, he is the face of sports in Japan. Um, this is a guy who is global. He's fought in the UK. He's obviously fought in the US. He's fought in Asia, and he's probably going to be fighting in the Middle East sometime soon. So it's great for him to be spreading his profile globally around the world, and a lot of that's thanks to DAZN and ESPN and other networks that obviously have highlighted his events worldwide. I do expect that his fight in Saudi Arabia is probably going to be on the zone, but we'll see if it is or isn't. We know that Turkey primarily does work with the zone, but in that particular case, maybe it is going to be with ESPN, even though we do know that ESPN is walking away from boxing. So that might be the perfect opportunity for the zone to take over for Inoue in that respect. And the zone, unlike ESPN, is global. I know some people, they are thick. No, ESPN is not global. If you don't live in the States, you can't watch ESPN unless you use a VPN, right? And if you don't use a VPN, you're not watching ESPN. Even in Canada, we can't watch ESPN. We have TSN. We don't get ESPN unless, of course, you use a VPN. In Asia and Europe and everywhere else in the world, again, we also can't watch ESPN. It doesn't mean we can't watch ESPN highlight shows on YouTube, because of course we can. Anything ESPN puts on their YouTube channel, we can see, but that's not events. Usually that's just highlights and things of that nature. Whereas DAZN is global. It's a global app like Netflix, where you can watch it everywhere in the world, regardless of having a VPN or not. Um, At this point, I won't label Inui the best small fighter of all time, but he's definitely now putting himself into that conversation. I don't think any of the fighters I just listed were nearly as popular as Inui is globally, right? I don't know if they were as popular in their countries as much as Inui is right now in Japan, especially Japan being a first world country, very financially solvent with a lots of businesses and marketing and magazines and newspapers and things of that nature. So it's a little different than, say, Mexico, which obviously is now becoming more of a first world country, but still I think more on the border of being a second world country, not quite a first world country at this point. So not a lot of money is being invested into those fighters back in the day, Morales and Barrera. Hence the reason why they did cross over and primarily fight in the US. Whereas that's the difference with Inui. He doesn't need the US. He doesn't need to cross over to the American market to make money. Actually, by crossing over to the American market, he's probably going to make less money in his event with Cardenas in Vegas than he would have made fighting Cardenas in Tokyo, right? But sometimes you take a loss to think about the future and the long-term, long-range goals of your product. And I definitely think that's what Bob Arum, ESPN, and Inui and his promoter, uh, what's his name, Ohashi, are obviously thinking. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. All I know is I'm super stoked that Inui is going to be fighting in Vegas this week, next weekend, on what is a historically great weekend of fights. I think the card in New York is sensational. I don't care who's headlining it. It doesn't matter. You have three of the best young up and coming fighters in the sport. So it's great for all three of them. It gives them a lot of attention and hopefully will help them become much more household names moving forward. And then, of course, Canelo, the face of American boxing, is finally branching out outside of North America, uh, putting his brand abroad, this time, obviously, in the Middle East. Hopefully, somewhere down the road, we could potentially see him in the UK. I think that would be super excellent. See him fight in Wembley. Phew, he fought in AT&T Stadium in Dallas, Texas. You go to Riyadh, you fight under a big venue. Then you go and fight in Wembley in the UK. Obviously, he fought in a big venue in Mexico as well. I mean, at this point of his career, those kind of big events are much more interesting and obviously what you're chasing after when you get to this point of your career, because you've already accomplished everything. So you're mostly looking for big events and things that will be remembered down the road. But I'm happy to see Inui in Vegas. I don't think it's going to shut down the haters, because haters going to hate. The irony is the whole glove situation that people are complaining about. Vegas allows him to wrap his gloves the exact same way. So the issue you had with him in Japan is not going to be different in Vegas, which is primarily probably why he is in Vegas. But let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Remember to leave your comments below, and I will see you next time.